Chapter 8. Athlon arrives. Testimony to its founder's under-evaluation of the popularity of the Perfectual. The original parking area for the monument was only big enough for about 6 or 7 cars. It was also much closer to the Perfectual than the auxiliary lot grudgingly permitted some years ago by the Monuments and Cemeteries Bureau. It lay at the foot of the Perfectual's magnificent hill, and directly adjacent to the little path that led to the one that left her Frank Elephant tomb. After he had parked in the small parking area, one of only 2 other cars, Athlon headed for Elephant's tomb, having heard about it, or rather them, for years. "Is this the tomb-swapping ceremony?" he asked as he rounded a corner and came upon a half-dozen men in matching vests moving something out of, or into, the open door of the tomb. "Please, sir, do not interrupt." One of the men detached himself from the others and approached Athlon with arms outstretched. "We have full power of attorney in this matter for the Elephant estate." "I'm sure you do," Athlon capitulated openly. "I merely want to observe." "You may do so," the man acquiesced with a nod. He turned towards his fellows, but remained by Athlon. It appeared that the men were moving a coffin out of the tomb. However, once this was done, they replaced it with another of nearly identical appearance. Athlon had decided to adopt the attitude of a spectator at a ceremony. So no one will know which tomb contains the real body," he whispered to his chaperone. "Exactly." The man took a quiet tone as well. He looked closer at Athlon. "Were you a fan of elephants?" Athlon put a finger behind his glasses to rub under an eye. "A fan? Well, I don't know that I could be called a fan. I respected him for his work, which I like a great deal of what I heard, but really I wasn't familiar enough with his work to be called a real fan." "Are you from around here?" the man asked. "No, I'm visiting." The man frowned. He turned back to his group again. "I was hoping you could tell me where's a good place for lunch." "Sorry." Athlon shook his head. He watched as the men locked the door to the tomb and took up the newly evicted coffin. They headed away from Athlon down a path on the opposite side. The man nodded at Athlon with a half-smile and followed them. Coming back to the parking area, Athlon looked up at the Perfectual. It didn't look so tall. The climb to the entrance was a gentle slope, the path lined with pebbles. Athlon understood that some optical illusion formed by the deceptive height of the hill and the angle of the upthrust structure diminished its size. He smiled. He was finally here. He started walking up the path. As he ascended, the low shrubs here and there fell away, and in the distance one could see the city of Wankins undulating towards the horizon like building blocks strewn over a bedspread. After this was over, he would have to visit the town. He had read in the paper that morning that they were having some sort of Leonard Nimoy Appreciation Week. That sounded like fun. Although he arrived at the top of the hill slightly winded, Athlon congratulated himself on being more nearly in shape than most men his age. He wondered how taxing the climb to the top of the stairs within the Perfectual would be. It didn't matter. He catches Burlum reading. Athlon decided to walk around the summit of the hill before going inside. He wanted to make sure he was revived from the climb before tackling the stairs. There was one main path that led across the grass to the front door. The pea gravel it was lined with expanded to cover a larger area before the door. There were benches and a waste bin against the opposite wall of the Perfectual. Athlon stepped off the path and began walking around the building towards the back, looking up at its changing profile against the sky. The circumference of the tower was surprisingly large. Tall shrubbery against the wall often obscured the next length of wall as Athlon made his way. Eventually he reached the opposite side of the Perfectual from the front door. Here he was a little surprised to see a service road leading up to a concrete pad on which stood a couple of storage sheds, a large trash container, and a couple of pieces of machinery that one would never associate with a place of spiritual regeneration. So it's just another human endeavor after all, thought Athlon. He walked on, stepping down from the grass onto the paved surface of the road. As he did so, he saw a uniformed man sitting in a lawn chair in the shadow of one of the sheds. He was reading. His presence so startled Athlon that he involuntarily erupted with, "Hello there!" "Hello," Burlum returned the greeting. Athlon was just about to continue on his way when he glanced at the book the uniformed man was reading. Something about the cover caught at Athlon's attention like the smell of bubble gum in a toy store. He stopped, approached. His mouth fell open. He mastered himself. "Hey, is that inside a vast blind machine?" he asked, pointing at the book. "Yes, it is," Burlum, for it was he, answered with a smile. Ordinarily, he would have resented this intrusion on his reading on his lunch hour, but as that hour had just begun, and the book he was reading was so obscure, so unlikely to be recognized by one of the visitors, that he responded enthusiastically. Perhaps the stranger had some insight into the book. Athlon smiled back, nodding. "You like it?" he asked after a moment. "I do. Have you read it?" Burlum asked. "Yes, I wrote it." Athlon smiled nervously, crookedly. Burlum snapped the book closed around his finger, glanced at the back of the book. It was a hardback from the library, covered with battered cellophane and a big sticker on the spine identifying it as fiction. He stared at the author's photograph on the back and glanced at Athlon. His eyes went back and forth a half-dozen times in only a second or two. "I'll be damned," Burlum admitted. He stood up, unsure of himself. "It's too bad it's a library book," he told Athlon. "I could have asked you to autograph it for me," he joked. "Yeah," Athlon returned. He came closer. "So how far are you into it?" "I just started it, really." Burlum opened the book. He was on page 51. "I'm at the part where Brontosaurus tries to fit in with the team." Athlon nodded, smiling crookedly. "You know," he said, tapping the inner seam of the open pages, "of all the books I've written, I think this is my favorite. I think it's my favorite because it's the one that first attracted critical notice." Burlum's legs were uncomfortably close to the seat of his chair. Athlon goes into the Prefectual. After he had circumnavigated the grounds, Athlon felt ready to pass within the entry. It was actually a set of double doors, wooden, painted brown, inset with several small windows, one of which bore a sticker proclaiming, "Proud member of the Wankins Monuments and Memorials League." Another sticker just over the bronze push plate helpfully read, "Push." Athlon did push. He took a breath and opened the door. Inside was a long tunnel lined with framed black and white photographs of persons that Athlon had no intention of familiarizing himself with now. Coming out of the tunnel, Athlon emerged in the bottom of an immense well, lit by small lamps mounted on columns stretching from a line about 12 feet up the wall, to the ceiling of this gigantic chimney. And hanging down from the ceiling was the legendary wishbone tuning fork. Was it made of bone? Wood? Athlon could not determine. Its sheen was like old, well-cared-for ivory, but never did any creature exist that could bear such a quantity. He was glad he had read extensively about the Prefectual and seen photographs of it, for he felt he might have peed in his pants otherwise. Or was that just the opposite? Was he close to peeing in his pants now at having his imagination and second-hand impressions realized? Just in case, he looked around for a restroom. He noted many nooks set in the walls. One, Athlon noted as he turned about, was a gift shop. Several were full of displays of some sort, whether historical or didactic, Athlon could not tell. A couple were official, employees only, and that one was the restrooms. Well, he didn't need to go right this minute. He could wait. Feeling like he was checking items off on a list, he decided to go into the gift shop first, get that out of the way. The gift shop was attended by the only female employed in the uniform capacity by the Prefectual. Athlon smiled at her as he entered. She, her name was Bruce, smiled back and nodded as she said hello. Athlon was mortified, momentarily paralyzed, and ultimately creeped out, but in a pleasant way, by the cheap, tiny novelties for sale. True, there were some souvenir books about the Prefectual Trust, and other landmarks in the Wankins area. There were also a couple of posters of the Prefectual, exterior and interior shots. But most of the items for sale were little plastic figurines and gimcracks, or is it gewgaws, of astonishing trashiness. They were heaped up, at least in some semblance of order, Athlon thought as he browsed, in transparent plastic bins stacked on multi-level display tables that lined the walls and the floor in rows. Returning to the entranceway to the store, where Bruce, hat on head, sat on a little stool next to the cash register, Athlon paused. "Strange that this place sells this kind of stuff, don't you think?" he asked the woman in a low voice. Bruce puckered up the corners of her mouth, a travesty of a smile, and cocked her head to one side. "Well," she drawled, "I've got a theory about that." She cast her round black eyes on Athlon. "I think they're like compensation prizes for children that are forced to come here." "Forced?" Athlon repeated incredulously. "Why would any child need coercion in order to come to this amazing—" He said none of this, however, for he saw it in the woman's soft, bear's eyes. This was just another place once you got used to it. Burlum speaks with Ned. "Hey," Burlum addressed Ned as he passed his badge through the payroll control mechanism. "I started watching that show you were telling me about, Mr. Gruesome." Ned, who had been heading for the corner with the antiquated fire extinguisher, continued in that direction, but now accompanied by Burlum. He swallowed the last bite of his sandwich and responded to his co-worker's conversational opening. "So, what'd you think?" he asked. Burlum gave it some thought. though let us not assume that his opinion had not been thoroughly and accurately worded before this moment. I'm willing to stay with it, provided you can assure me that it doesn't turn into a romance, a soap opera. Well, Ned began. Just tell me this. Burlum jumped back in. Does that red-haired girl and the main guy fall in love? Well, yeah, but, Ned threw up his hands in entreaty, begging to be given time to explain. It's not what you think. That girl is a screw tape. She's playing both sides. Okay, Burlum interrupted. Don't tell me any more. Which ones have you seen? They reached the corner. It was odd in that it seemed to serve as only a place to store the old fire extinguisher. There was no other corner like it in the Prefectural, primarily because it wasn't exactly a corner at all, but a flat section of wall just big enough to hold the fire extinguisher, meeting its two fellow walls at 5-degree angles. Just the first two, Burlum replied. Oh, you've got a ways to go. Ned took up a post adjacent to the fire extinguisher. That fire extinguisher! It was a tarnished, old copper-colored canister with a steering wheel-type valve on the top that looked kin to the knobs and levers on Captain Nemo's ship. A cracked black rubber hose hung against the length of the canister like the tail of a whipshy dog. A brass or bronze plate was riveted to the front of the tank. It bore the image of a man in silhouette, holding back the forces of nature itself from a tiny stylization of a house. In words, Ronson Pyromate was easily read by Burlum as he took up a stance on the other side of the obsolete old fire extinguisher. Let us hear no more about it. How many seasons are there? Burlum needed clarification. They're currently showing the second one. Ned scanned the floor for interesting-looking visitors, but saw no one but the usual handful of old men. Hey, you see that guy over there, just coming out of the happenstance exhibit room? Burlum turned his back slightly and pointed so that the object of his indication could not see him do so. Yeah? Ned confirmed. He's a writer. He's the author of the book I'm reading right now. Bullshit. Ned gawped at the white-headed visitor. Yeah, he was walking on the back and saw me reading his book on lunch. What, his picture was on the back or something? Yeah, it's him all right. He gave me some insight into the book that I found very helpful. Is it science fiction? Burlum considered. Well, not really. I mean, it has science fiction elements, but mainly it's stream of consciousness. Do you know what that is in literature? Ned recalls an incident. After Burlum had wandered away to say hello to the man he claimed was some famous author, Ned recalled an incident in which, many years ago, he had met Hugh Hefner. I had only been working at the Prefectural about a year, maybe a little less. One day I was standing by the water fountain when this group of people walked in. They weren't the usual visitors. This was a couple of rich guys and about 5 or 6 young, beautiful girls, all talking excitedly like they were attending some awards ceremony. It was like a party to them, and it took me a minute to realize, hey, that guy in the shades, that's Hugh Hefner. And this is usually the part of the story where somebody stops me and says, are you sure it was Hugh Hefner? And my response is, yes, I was sure it was Hugh Hefner as soon as I got a good look at him. And it turned out that I was right, and you'd know if you just wait a minute and allow me to tell the story, you'd know all that I know and how I knew it. I actually spoke to him. This is the part that nobody believes, and that's because they can't believe that Hugh Hefner would drink out of a shoddy little water fountain like we have here, but he did. He came over and took a sip of water. He kind of winked at me from behind his sunglasses. I could see it, and he pointed his finger at me and said, how's it going, sport? And so as he's coming up from his drink of water, I leaned over a little bit towards him and I said, the water didn't taste funny, did it? And he swallowed it and stood there for a second and said, with a big smile, he said, tasted just fine to me. Ned went on to recall how Hefner and his entourage climbed to the top of the stairs and posed for photographs, none of which ever appeared in the pages of Playboy, the money machine that allowed Hefner the luxury of such frivolity. Alternate versions of Ned's incident recollection mention Hefner's attire, striped Frenchman's shirt, silk bandana, and Mickey Mouse yachtsman's cap. Through our access to the Master Keeper, we have obtained descriptions of Hefner's wardrobe on his 1979 World Tour, the only possible time that he could have visited Prefectural during the time period Ned refers to. He did indeed wear a striped Frenchman-type shirt, a silk bandana, and a yachtsman's or captain's cap. As to whether the cap bore the likeness of Mickey Mouse and a shield surrounded by a life preserver and an anchor, the judgment of history is doubtful. We also know that he wore navy blue bell-bottom slacks and extremely expensive leather sandals made by a craftsman in a small town. If necessary, we can discover the original crayon tracings of Hefner's feet from the same source. Such biometric data could prove useful should our organization need further leverage in dealing with the syndicate or in bolstering our claim of Hefner's endorsement. If only we could legitimately claim patronage as well, however, the incident that Ned has recounted for us does not meet the test for a public announcement. Hefner signed the guest book with a funny name, Spurt Reynolds and Family. We know it's his right, and we've had it analyzed, but nothing definitively linking him with ever having visited the Perfectual. It is, therefore, the determination of this committee that should we prove unable to obtain Hugh Hefner's endorsement, whether contested or not, we will not then claim it after his death, not officially, and certainly not in any overt way. We'll hire the right people to start the rumors that will lead to public association of the dead man with the ideology. Burlum talks with Athlon. Burlum was smiling as he approached Athlon. "Hi," he said. "Hello again," the writer answered. He was standing on a design inset into the floor just below the wishbone tuning fork. It was a star of some kind. Blue tiles contrasted against muted orange to form the design. Athlon gestured at it with both hands thrown out. "What is it?" he asked the caretaker. Burlum smiled. He had grown so lax in his attention to his function that he kept one hand in his pocket as he pointed to the star. "It's the corolla of mechanism," Burlum explained. Athlon looked up at his new acquaintance with a smile. "It looks like it was installed within living memory," he accused. Burlum snickered, and that's because it was. Some kind of drainage problem finally caught up with the building. He waved at the vault of this tremendous deep beehive, and they had to dig it up from the original floor. They had to dig up the original floor, he continued, dropping his gaze to the tile work. "When they finished work, they had this installed and told us to tell everybody that it represents the corolla of mechanism." Burlum removed both hands from his pockets and shook them in the air with ecstatic, mystic tremors, whatever that is. Before Athlon could reply, Burlum added more to his bill of particulars. "They made it up," he declared, throwing out his hands in a duplication of Athlon's initial gesture, "and told us to go along with it, to pretend that it's been part of the Perfectual lore from the beginning, as if it's equal to original Perfectual lore." He added the disclaimer with a reminder of his identity, contested or not, as a caretaker. "I wouldn't let it bother you," Athlon spoke with a soothing, fatherly manner. He smiled. "Just think of it as yet one more tradition that has become associated with this place. As long as the truth of when it was installed is not concealed, it should be all right." He appended his remarks in an undertone. Stepping back and raising his eyes to the wishbone tuning fork, Athlon estimated its height off the floor at 12 feet or more. "What is it?" he asked, in a tone suggesting conspiratorial intimacy and craving more. Burlum stepped closer and joined his visitor in contemplation of the object overhead. "Well," he said, "I've been here a long time, and I've heard every explanation there is, from the people who run this place to visitors with expertise in any conceivable subject. I've heard all the stories handed down from the people who first worked here. I know what they claim on TV and on the web." He paused, as if to clear all that away before proceeding. "And I will tell you, and I think I'll tell everybody from now on, that it is my opinion that it is an engine." "An engine?" Athlon gasped. It was as if your only son had come to you and announced that he enjoyed eating shit. He turned aside, shook his head. "What do you mean, engine?" he asked, hopefully. Maybe the younger man was kidding. He turned back towards Burlum. "An engine for an extraterrestrial spacecraft," Burlum continued. "Come on," he gestured vaguely at Athlon. "We both know such things exist." Athlon sighed. He had taken on board a reader. "Yeah," he nodded in submission. "I think I'd like to climb to the top now. Please come with me." Athlon remembers an incident. The incident that Athlon now recalled wasn't exactly an incident, as it was something that actually happened on a TV show, but given that the show was broadcast live, and given that the show's producers most likely did not intend for the incident to happen, Athlon felt certain that the term was appropriate. The TV show was called Orange Marshmallows. It was a featured part of the public broadcasting system's national schedule during its 1977 season. I realize that the use of such terms as schedule and season in reference to PBS are not exactly analogous to the same terms used in connection with a major private broadcaster of the same time period, but I feel that they are at least as appropriate as incident, and that their use is generally understood and shouldn't prove an obstacle to anyone outside old-time employees of PBS. Athlon paused for a moment to recollect what he was supposed to be recalling. "Yes, of course," he nodded to himself. "Orange Marshmallows." The show didn't last long, proving both expensive to produce and unpopular with its intended demographic group, college professors and the children of hippies. It purported to detail the adventures of the members of a grand jury as they visited various locales around the fictional city of Reuter Seconds in search of more insight into the interminable case of the Temple of Indefinite Erasure versus Manly Flagbound. On the episode under review, within the overstuffed cousin and grouper fouled mind of Athlon, the grand jury was visiting a dairy. Jury foreman and Coca-Cola executive Reg Flummox was the first off the bus at the run-down old facility. The parking lot was a muddy expanse strewn haphazardly with gravel. "Geez, what do they do when schools visit?" Sarah McMistress, arguably the most popular character on the show, asked as she stepped carefully around the most muddy patches. "I don't believe many schools come here," the bus driver, a city employee, replied as he lit a small cigar. "When they want to go on a field trip to a dairy, they usually go to Stunk and Brisket Consolidated Dairies on the other side of town." Some bus driver, thought Jasmine, whose thoughts were seen as cartoons shadowing her head like an angry cloud. He doesn't know the middle of the university campus from the other side of town. "I thought this show was live," Portsmouth Tortoisehead commented to our fellow juror as they waited to disembark. "It is, stupid," the woman hissed. "Then how can I see the cartoon?" Tortoisehead demanded in a whisper so low that it had to be subtitled to be understood. "You can see the cartoon," the woman, who was both related to Manly Flagbound and a member of the Temple of Indefinite Erasure, but hadn't informed the court of these relationships, hissed back. "Of course," the man explained. "Can't you see my subtitles?" He gestured at the air about his midsection. The woman looked closely, not allowing her gaze to linger anywhere near the man's groin. "No," she said. "All right, everybody," called Foreman Flummox. "Let's get organized. We need—" He did not finish the admonition, for at that moment a cow, hitherto hidden by the bulk of the bus, charged around the corner and ran him down. The director of the show, who now emerged from behind the camera to see about his injured actor, had brought along his children. They later complained to him that touching a cow's udder was gross. He recalled this funny anecdote at the actor's funeral. Burlum speaks to Pine. Earlier that day, Burlum had gone to his supervisor, Pine, with the sad news that he was quitting. "Quitting?" Pine repeated. "You can't be serious." "I'm afraid I am," Burlum insisted. "I'm giving you 2 weeks' notice." Burlum sighed heavily. He was seated at his desk in the tiny office. "Sit down, Burlum," he invited as he rubbed his eyes. He looked at his soon-to-be former co-worker and took a deep breath. "Is there anything wrong?" he asked. "Anything wrong at home?" Burlum did not need to consider. "No," he shook his head. "No, as a matter of fact, things are going well." This was true enough in the sense that today is your birthday, but you haven't received any presents yet. Burlum recently instigated some changes with the intention of making his marriage better, but they had not yet borne fruit. "Anything wrong here? At work?" Pine probed further. "Well, yeah, actually there is." Burlum could feel his heart beat a little faster. "I really feel that the ideals on which this place was founded are being sold short. You know," he pointed his finger as he warmed to his words, "there is a whole philosophy embodied in this building." "Can you articulate it?" Pine jumped in to ask. Burlum, momentarily taken aback at the challenge, answered Pine forthrightly. "Yes, I think I can. It's the belief that mankind is better than it realizes, that we can rise above our own mortality." Burlum considered going further, but feared saying any more because what he had already said was so good. Pine nodded briefly from the chin up, as if to say, "Is this all you have to bring me on this solemn occasion?" "I disagree," he told Burlum. "I don't think it has anything to do with mankind at all. I think it has to do with the individual." "Ah," Burlum smiled crookedly and wiggled about in his seat. But all of the individuals taken together form mankind." Pine sighed, looked down at some tiny object of trivial value that had found its way into his desk. It would probably sit there for years before disappearing. "Burlum, I have to tell you that it is now official company policy that emphasis on the individual, emphasis on the professional's philosophy is our policy." Now, Pine realized that he was not being clear as he could. While he tried to pull his thoughts together, Burlum interjected with another point. "You said company," he pounced. "Since when is the professional a company?" "Since 1993, Pine provided the answer. Burlum, not heeding, continued at full speed. "It's supposed to be a non-profit organization. It's supposed to be a monument to a whole body of thought summed up in the essence of the universe itself." He pinched an imaginary sparkle of dust in the air. "Burlum," Pine nearly raised his voice into the unpleasant zone. "What are you going to do if you quit?" The caretaker looked into the tangle of Pine's eyebrows. "I'm debt-free," he explained. "I don't have any children. I can get by doing something else." "Burlum, I want you to consider this before you do it," Pine begged. The armor. Athlon, accompanied by Burlum, approached the massive wooden staircase that wound about the walls up to the ceiling. Before he set foot on the bottom step, however, Athlon's attention was arrested by the old suit of armor standing on a pedestal nearby. "What's this?" he asked. Burlum smiled. He joined Athlon before the armor. "That," he said, "was donated for unknown reasons by a couple who were one of the original contributors to the Perfectual Trust." Athlon examined the suit of armor closer. It appeared to be a German replica of typical 14th century ceremonial armor, probably made in the early 19th century. For unknown reasons, you say? Athlon repeated. He opened the visor and looked into the face of a young woman. It was a department store mannequin. Athlon looked at Burlum questioningly. I put that in there, Burlum told his visitor. The original dummy had rotted. Mercer's was closing down. They were throwing out all their old mannequins in display racks. I got a mannequin and replaced the dummy with it. He didn't mention the second mannequin that he had taken home with him. But what significance has this armor to the rest of the perfectual? Athlon gestured towards the wishbone tuning fork. None that I can see, Burlum forcefully returned. His tone wasn't angry, but it leaked exasperation. How long has it been here? Burlum took a breath. It was here when I started working here years ago. Athlon nodded. So it's purely decorative? If you want to call it that. Just like the star on the floor, really. Burlum glanced at the Korolev mechanism. Well, he demurred, there's no official correlation between the armor and the proclaimed doctrines of the perfectual. Does there have to be? Burlum sighed. I suppose not, he admitted. Burlum pointed at one of the rooms set in the wall, one that contained glass cases full of historical displays. I noticed in that room a stuffed fox in one of the cases, he informed his guide. I know. Burlum shook his head ruefully. So much corruption, so much frippery. What did any of it have to do with a monument erected supposedly to encourage man to wake the hell up? Athlon studied the younger man. Where had he formulated his extraterrestrial spaceship engine theory? Are you ready? He asked Burlum. Sure. They started back towards the stairs. By the way, Burlum paused in mid-step. Are you working on a book right now? I'm supposed to be. As he put his foot on the bottom step, he turned to Burlum. I'll tell you this, though. Not everything in the book, or any of my books, has to do with the book itself. He shrugged his shoulders. But how you're supposed to know what's what is beyond me. Together they climbed. Athlon had been worried about the stairs, being already half worn out from the hill. He smiled, thinking of the whole day's adventure thus far as some kind of test. It was a test of worthiness before ascending and obtaining the blessing of the magic, as if he needed something to dedicate his book to. At his right elbow was the handrail overlooking the deepening well. Burlum walked on his left against the wall. Would you like to walk on this side? Burlum asked solicitously. No. Athlon shook his head. No, I'm fine. He looked down. The height didn't seem to bother him. He looked up. Perhaps things would look different from up there. I stopped counting how many times I've been to the top. You have to make yourself stop counting. I think you'd go crazy retiring from here knowing exactly how many times you climbed the stairs. I think you'd be crazy to retire from here, Athlon advised, not particularly caring now whether his words were white-wasted. I'm not going to. I've quit. Burlum said it indifferently, but as the last syllable left the edge of his teeth, he grinned fabulously, feeling as if he was a kid who has drank a glass of grape Kool-Aid and has nothing more to do than ride his bike. Really? Athlon sounded amazed and curious as to the reason for this course of action. Today? Earlier today. I gave them 2 weeks' notice, but after realizing the sort of political pressure I'd be under if I stayed, I decided to make this my last day. Are you married? Athlon glanced at Burlum around the side of his glasses. Yes, Burlum answered, but my wife is a robot. He said it as if trying out a voice for an audition at the local amateur theater. Oh, really? Burlum gaped. I've heard about those. What, He paused, trying to formulate a question. What is she like? Burlum supplied one for his companion. Yeah. Burlum glanced to his left. Every 12 feet or so there was a small brass plaque set into the stone wall. These were proclamations of endorsement from famous men or corporations. Burlum sneered. There was a bas-relief of a smiling Timothy Leary. She's wonderful, he imparted finally. He was serious. Sometime later they met an elderly man who was coming back down. He was dressed in pale blue pants with an elastic waistband, a threadbare plaid shirt, and sneakers secured by Velcro. His eyes were watery and red, as if he had been crying. He looked at Burlum and Athlon as he clung to the rail. It's worth it, fellers, he promised. Every step of the way. Athlon spent many steps after this encounter trying to forget it, to denigrate it, to baffle over the banality of its author. His thoughts were interrupted by Burlum's announcement of their arrival at the terminus. It's all boxed in, Athlon gasped as he stepped onto the platform at the top. Indeed, the platform, large enough to hold at least a dozen people, was enclosed by a lattice of large timbers that allowed one only enough space to pass one's arm through. Why, I couldn't kill myself if I wanted to, he cried, touching the top of the wishbone tuning fork. Yeah, we try not to publicize that fact, Burlum laughed. The end of Part 2 of At Home with the Gas Giants.